Representative Judah Engelmeyer telling me by phone earlier today, Tom, that yes, a three-way call was made between one of Combs's lawyers, who did bring in another person on that call with Combs while he has been at Fort Dix, but that there was nothing improper about it.
Music mogul Sean Diddy Combs facing more time behind bars. His release date pushed back to June of 2028 instead of May of that same year. The news coming after reports of Combs drinking in prison, something he denies, after he was accepted into a rehab program in prison that could have reduced his sentence by up to a year.
The idea that the Diddy sentence story might not actually be over didn't come from an announcement. It didn't come from a press conference or a breaking headline. It came from something quieter and far more unsettling: the way people started talking differently. The way legal language began to feel less settled. The way old confidence turned into careful silence. Because when a case is truly finished, it doesn't keep pulling attention back. And this one did. Diddy has never existed in the public eye as just a name or a celebrity brand. His position was built on influence over access, over careers, over which doors opened and which quietly stayed closed. That kind of power doesn't stop operating just because a sentence is handed down. It adapts. It shifts. And sometimes it exposes cracks that weren't visible before. That's why the word people keep circling around isn't closure. It's uncertainty. Not the kind that sparks rumors, but the kind that shows up in behavior. In how conversations suddenly become cautious. In how certain associations create distance. In how the case itself still feels active even when, on paper, it shouldn't be. Before going any deeper, pause for a moment and answer this honestly: when someone with Diddy's level of influence is sentenced, do you believe that's usually the end of the story, or just the end of the loudest chapter? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're following this closely, subscribe, because this isn't about sensational updates. It's about understanding what actually happens after the spotlight moves away. What many people miss is that sentencing doesn't equal resolution. Especially in cases where the individual involved isn't just defending themselves, but also an entire network of relationships, reputations, and institutional interests. A sentence addresses one dimension. It doesn't automatically resolve the pressure surrounding everything else. In situations like this, scrutiny doesn't disappear. It redistributes. Some of it moves into civil spaces. Some of it becomes procedural. Some of it stays cultural, reshaping how the person is perceived long after the legal phase most people paid attention to ends. And that redistribution is often where things get complicated. This is why the Diddy sentence still feels unsettled. Not because of any single rumor or claim, but because the structure around the case remains under strain. High-profile figures don't exist inside a vacuum. They exist inside systems designed to absorb shock and protect continuity. When those systems are tested, they don't always respond cleanly. They adjust slowly, sometimes unevenly, sometimes defensively. One of the clearest signs of that adjustment is silence. Silence where certainty once existed. Silence where reassurance would normally appear. Silence that isn't accidental but strategic. When powerful systems feel stable, they speak confidently. When they don't, they become careful. That shift has been visible here. Another reason this story refuses to settle is the sheer scale of unresolved exposure surrounding it. Civil actions operate differently from criminal proceedings. They don't move toward a single moment of finality. They unfold gradually, often out of public view, creating pressure that doesn't announce itself but never fully goes away. That alone prevents any clean sense of conclusion. And for someone like Diddy, reputational consequences don't pause just because legal language reaches a stopping point. Brand relationships reassess. Partnerships reconsider. Associations quietly change tone. These are not dramatic events. They're subtle signals that confidence has been replaced by caution. What makes this especially important is precedent. When cases involving powerful figures reach this stage, they don't just affect the individual involved. They influence how future cases are handled. They set informal boundaries. They communicate what levels of scrutiny are tolerated and where the system draws the line. That kind of pressure doesn't end with a sentence, it intensifies afterward. This is why people are paying attention again. Not because something explosive has already surfaced, but because too many signs suggest that the environment around the case is still active. When outcomes are fully accepted, attention fades. Here, it hasn't. Influence also complicates accountability in ways most people don't see. Power doesn't vanish overnight. Networks don't dissolve instantly. And consequences don't always arrive in the order people expect. Sometimes they pause. Sometimes they resurface. Sometimes they arrive through channels that weren't being watched closely. That reality creates a lingering tension around cases like this. A sense that the official outcome addressed one aspect, but left others unresolved. And unresolved pressure has a way of returning when conditions shift. This doesn't mean conclusions should be rushed or assumptions made. It means observation matters. Watching how institutions behave after the spotlight dims often reveals more than watching how they perform while it's on. Confidence, distance, silence, these are all signals, and they don't appear without cause. For Diddy, the sentence marked a turning point, but not a clean endpoint. His influence, his history, and the scale of attention surrounding the case ensure that the story doesn't simply conclude and disappear. It lingers in quieter spaces where outcomes are shaped without headlines. And that lingering is the reason this conversation exists at all. Because when a case truly ends, it settles. The noise fades. The narrative stabilizes. Here, that hasn't happened. Instead, what remains is a sense that the structure around the sentence is still adjusting, still absorbing, still deciding what it's willing to carry forward and what it's not. That's not drama. That's how power responds under sustained scrutiny. And it's why the Diddy sentence story continues to feel unfinished, even without a single new announcement. What keeps cases like this alive isn't noise. It's pressure. Pressure that doesn't announce itself but never fully releases either. Once a sentence is handed down, the public assumes the system has done its job. But behind that assumption, the system continues to move slowly, cautiously, and often out of sight. This is where many people misunderstand how accountability actually works at high levels. Criminal sentencing is only one mechanism. It's the loudest, most visible one, but it isn't the most enduring. After sentencing, influence is reassessed, not erased. Power structures don't collapse, they recalibrate. For someone like Diddy, that recalibration matters more than the ruling itself. His reach was never confined to one role or one industry. Music was only one layer. Branding, partnerships, gatekeeping, and long-standing alliances formed an ecosystem that extended far beyond the courtroom. When a figure at the center of such an ecosystem faces consequences, the system doesn't stop functioning. It studies the damage and adjusts to protect itself. That adjustment is subtle. It doesn't show up as announcements. It shows up as distance, as hesitation, as conversations that suddenly require lawyers in the room. When people feel secure, they speak freely. When they don't, they minimize exposure. This is why the sentence didn't create relief. It created caution. Another factor that keeps this story active is the way civil pressure behaves. Unlike criminal cases, civil actions don't converge toward one final moment. They stretch. They overlap. They operate on different standards and timelines. And they continue regardless of whether public attention moves on. That ongoing exposure creates a kind of background tension that never fully disappears. For powerful figures, civil pressure can be more destabilizing than criminal punishment. It doesn't just threaten freedom, it threatens legacy, finances, and long-term reputation. And it does so quietly, without spectacle. That quiet pressure is often what reshapes behavior the most. This is where the idea of reopening comes from, not as a formal declaration, but as a recognition that the environment surrounding the case remains unsettled. When people sense that uncertainty, they behave differently. They reassess loyalty, they reconsider risk, and they prepare for outcomes that haven't been publicly acknowledged yet. That behavior is what keeps attention from fading. There's also a psychological element at play. High-profile cases involving influence challenge a deeply ingrained belief that power eventually protects itself completely. When that belief is shaken, even slightly, people start looking for signs of what might happen next. Not because they want drama, but because the outcome feels incomplete. In many cases, sentencing creates a narrative illusion of closure. But illusion doesn't equal resolution, especially when the individual involved still represents a symbol of how influence operates. The story stops being about punishment and starts being about precedent. Precedent matters because it shapes expectations. If powerful figures are perceived as insulated after consequences, systems revert to old habits. If they're perceived as still exposed, behavior across the industry shifts. That tension between insulation and exposure is what people are sensing here. Another reason this case hasn't settled is the way silence has spread around it. Silence from figures who once spoke confidently. Silence from institutions that typically rush to manage narratives. Silence that isn't accidental but calculated. When institutions believe a situation is resolved, they move on publicly. When they're uncertain, they slow down. That slowdown is visible. It shows up in how the case is referenced carefully, indirectly, without emphasis. It shows up in how language changes from certainty to neutrality. And it shows up in how few people are willing to speak decisively about what comes after the sentence. Silence is often misinterpreted as absence. In reality, it's presence of caution. This is also where influence complicates timelines. Accountability doesn't arrive all at once when power is involved. It arrives in phases, some visible, some procedural, some cultural, and some only felt internally by the systems managing risk. For Diddy, the sentence addressed one phase. It did not resolve the broader question of how influence interacts with consequence. That question remains open, not because anyone is making claims, but because the system itself hasn't answered it yet. That unresolved tension is what people are responding to. Not headlines, not speculation, behavior. The more closely observers watch, the clearer it becomes that the story didn't stabilize after sentencing. It shifted, and shifts like that don't happen without reason. They happen when systems anticipate further pressure. This doesn't mean conclusions should be drawn prematurely. It means patterns should be recognized. When powerful cases truly conclude, they recede. Attention disperses. The narrative becomes historical. Here, the narrative remains present. That presence isn't fueled by outrage. It's fueled by uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether the sentence marked a boundary or merely a checkpoint. Uncertainty about how much exposure still exists. And uncertainty about how systems respond when scrutiny refuses to fade quietly. These questions aren't being asked loudly, but they are being asked consistently. And consistency matters more than volume. For now, the most telling aspect of this story isn't what's being said, it's what's being withheld. The careful language, the measured distance, the lack of confidence that typically follows finality. Those details suggest a system still adjusting rather than resting. And systems only adjust when they anticipate further stress. That anticipation is what keeps this case alive in conversation, even without dramatic updates. It's what gives weight to the idea that the sentence story doesn't feel finished. Not because something has been announced, but because something still hasn't settled. The longer that tension holds, the harder it becomes to pretend the outcome fully resolved the underlying issue. And once that realization sets in, attention doesn't disappear. It narrows. What remains now is a case study in how power behaves after consequence. Not in theory, but in practice. And the way this behavior unfolds will determine whether the sentence becomes an endpoint or simply a pause. At a certain point, uncertainty stops feeling passive and starts feeling deliberate. Not because answers suddenly appear, but because the absence of answers becomes too organized to ignore. This is where the story crosses an invisible line from unresolved to actively restrained. That line is reached when systems stop reacting and start managing. Up until now, the behavior surrounding the Diddy sentence could be explained as recalibration. Institutions adjusting, networks reassessing risk, allies creating distance. All of that fits within normal patterns of self-preservation. But eventually, something shifts. The adjustment phase ends, and a containment phase begins. Containment doesn't look dramatic. It looks controlled. Language becomes precise. Public statements narrow. References become indirect. Conversations that once happened openly move behind closed doors. And most noticeably, questions stop being answered altogether. Not because answers don't exist, but because answering them introduces variables the system no longer wants to entertain. This is the point where the sentence stops being the center of the story and becomes a boundary line. Everything on one side is acknowledged. Everything on the other side is carefully managed. For powerful figures, this phase is critical, because it determines whether accountability expands or stalls. And it's here that influence reveals its true function, not to erase consequences, but to limit their spread. Diddy's position makes this phase especially visible. His history isn't isolated to one incident or one role. It's embedded across decades of relationships, partnerships, and gatekeeping dynamics. That depth creates exposure that can't be resolved by a single legal outcome, can only be controlled, and control always leaves fingerprints. One of the clearest signs is narrative compression. Complex situations are simplified. Focus is redirected to what's already known, while anything unresolved is framed as settled. This doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when systems decide that further examination creates more risk than benefit. Another sign is selective amplification. Certain aspects of the story are repeated. Others quietly disappear, not because they were disproven, but because they complicate the narrative. Complexity is dangerous when influence is under pressure. This is where the idea of a story being reopened stops being symbolic and starts being structural. Not reopened publicly, but internally. Reviewed, assessed, weighed. Decisions are made about what can be allowed to surface and what must remain contained. That process doesn't require announcements. It requires alignment. Alignment among legal teams. Alignment among institutions. Alignment among those who benefit from stability more than transparency. And once alignment is achieved, silence becomes uniform. Uniform silence is never accidental. This is also where public attention subtly shifts. People sense that something has hardened, that the atmosphere has changed. Curiosity deepens not because of new information, but because of resistance to information. When stories push back against scrutiny, it signals that scrutiny still matters. This is the pressure point. At this stage, accountability is no longer about uncovering facts. It's about determining how much exposure the system will tolerate. That decision isn't made by one person. It's made collectively through behavior, and behavior right now suggests restraint. This doesn't mean additional consequences are guaranteed. It means the possibility hasn't been closed. And in systems built on influence, possibility is often more destabilizing than certainty. That's why this phase feels heavier than the earlier ones. Earlier, the story was moving. Now it's holding, and holding creates tension. The longer tension is held, the more deliberate it feels. This is also where precedent becomes unavoidable. How this case is managed now sends a signal beyond the individuals involved. It communicates whether influence still determines the limits of accountability, or whether those limits are shifting. That signal matters to everyone watching from inside similar systems. And they are watching, because if containment works here, it becomes a model. If it fails, it becomes a warning. Either outcome carries weight far beyond this case alone. This is why conversations around the sentence have changed tone. Not louder, quieter, more careful, less declarative. People don't speak cautiously when they feel safe. They speak cautiously when outcomes are still being negotiated. Negotiation doesn't always involve deals. Sometimes it involves timing. Sometimes it involves patience. Sometimes it involves waiting to see whether attention fades enough to move forward without resistance. But attention hasn't faded. Instead, it has narrowed. Fewer voices, more focus, less noise. And that kind of attention is harder to dismiss than outrage, because it doesn't burn out quickly. It stays. This is the point where the system has to decide whether to release pressure or absorb it. Release means allowing further scrutiny. Absorb means holding the line and hoping interest dissipates. Both options carry risk. And that decision is what determines whether the sentence becomes a conclusion or merely a pause. Right now, everything about this case suggests pause. A pause marked by alignment, restraint, and controlled silence. A pause that feels intentional rather than transitional. And once a pause is intentional, it stops being neutral. It becomes a choice. That choice to contain rather than conclude is the real turning point in this story. Because it changes the question entirely. It's no longer about what happened. It's about what is allowed to happen next. And once that question is on the table, the idea that the sentence story is finished becomes impossible to defend. The pressure has shifted. The stakes have changed. And the system is no longer reacting, it's deciding. That decision is still unfolding. And its outcome will define whether this story settles or resurfaces in a way no one can fully control. When a system reaches the point of choosing containment over resolution, the story stops being about any one individual. It becomes about endurance, about how long pressure can be held without release, and how much strain a structure can absorb before something gives way. That is where this case now sits. The sentence did not erase influence. It did not dismantle networks. And it did not neutralize the forces that shaped the environment long before a courtroom ever entered the picture. What it did was expose a fault line, one that now runs quietly beneath everything connected to the story. Power doesn't disappear when challenged. It recalibrates, tightens, it learns. And in doing so, it reveals its priorities. What it chooses to protect, what it allows to be questioned, and what it refuses to let surface. This is why closure still feels distant. Not because the legal process failed to act, but because the cultural and institutional questions remain unanswered. Questions about access, about silence, about how much protection is afforded to influence even after consequences are imposed. Those questions don't dissolve with a sentence. They linger in the behavior that follows. What becomes clear at this stage is that accountability is not a moment, it's a process. And processes move at the pace of resistance. The most revealing element of this phase is not outrage or reaction, but normalization. The quiet attempt to return to equilibrium, to let time smooth over discomfort, to reframe the outcome as sufficient, even if the underlying conditions remain unchanged. That effort is subtle, but it's visible. It shows up in how quickly focus is redirected, in how language softens, in how narratives compress complexity into simplicity. These are not random shifts. They are signs of a system trying to stabilize without fully confronting what destabilized it in the first place. And stabilization always comes at a cost. That cost is usually paid by those with the least power, the ones whose experiences never shaped policy, whose voices never guided decisions, and whose silence was often mistaken for acceptance. When systems prioritize continuity, they rarely pause to assess who continuity serves. This is why the idea of the story reopening continues to resonate. Not as a legal action, but as a moral and structural question. Has the system truly addressed what allowed this to happen? Or has it simply absorbed the shock and moved forward unchanged? The answer to that question determines whether accountability is real or symbolic. Symbolic accountability satisfies timelines. Real accountability disrupts patterns. And disruption is something powerful systems resist until resistance becomes more costly than change. That tipping point hasn't fully arrived yet. But the pressure is no longer hypothetical. It's present in the way conversations are managed, in the way distance replaces confidence, in the way certainty gives way to careful restraint. These are not signs of resolution. They are signs of negotiation. Negotiation between exposure and stability, between transparency and protection, between what is known and what is permitted to be examined. The outcome of that negotiation will not be announced. It will be observed. It will be visible in whether patterns repeat or break, in whether boundaries become clearer or remain flexible, and in whether influence continues to dictate the limits of consequence. This is why attention matters more than outrage. Outrage burns quickly. Attention endures. Attention asks questions that don't go away. Attention watches what happens after the cameras move on. And that kind of attention is what systems struggle with the most. Because once people stop accepting surface endings, stories don't end where they're supposed to. They linger, they resurface, they evolve, and sometimes they force change not through spectacle, but through persistence. The Diddy sentence story exists in that space now. Not concluded, not exploding, but unresolved in ways that matter. What happens from here will not depend on one person, one ruling, or one headline. It will depend on whether the structures that enabled silence are willing to confront themselves or whether they will continue doing what they've always done. Wait. Waiting has worked before. It has allowed countless stories to fade without consequence. But it only works when attention collapses. This time, attention hasn't collapsed. It has sharpened. And that changes the math. Because when enough people understand how systems protect themselves, patience becomes scrutiny. And scrutiny, sustained long enough, becomes pressure that can't be ignored. That is the real significance of this moment. Not the sentence itself, but what it revealed about how influence behaves when challenged and what remains unresolved when accountability stops short of reform. The story doesn't end with a declaration. It ends with a responsibility shared by institutions, by industries, and by audiences who decide whether silence is acceptable or worth questioning. If you made it this far, you already understand why this story doesn't feel finished. So tell me in the comments, do you think powerful systems are capable of real accountability, or do they only adapt until the pressure fades? And if you want more deep, evidence-driven investigations like this, subscribe to the channel because the most important stories are rarely the loudest ones.